In the central Sahara, there are places where the land feels older than memory. Mountains rise like black islands from a sea of stone. Wind combs the sand into endless ripples, then flattens them again as if erasing footsteps on purpose. Distances are deceptive. A ridge that seems close stays far away for hours. A valley that looks empty suddenly reveals a line of acacias, a hidden wadi, the faint geometry of old walls. And in that vastness, a story has survived, passed by word of mouth, reshaped by politics, protected by silence, and strengthened by the kind of belief that doesn't need paper to endure. It is the story of Tin Hinan, the woman many Tuareg of the Hagar, also called the Hogar, recognize as an ancestress, a founding figure, and in some tellings, a queen. But Tin Hinan is more than a name. She is a meeting point between two worlds, the living world of oral tradition, genealogy, and identity, and the material world of archaeology. Stones, bones, jewelry, and the stubborn facts of time. Because somewhere near Abalessa, not far from modern Tamanrasset in southern Algeria, there stands a monumental structure long associated with her, a place that tradition claimed as her resting place, and that researchers came to investigate as early as the 20th century. That structure, part fortress, part enclosure, part mausoleum, has become one of the Sahara's most famous tombs. And at the center of the story is a question as haunting as the desert itself. Was Tin Hinan a historical woman whose influence echoed into Tuareg social order, or a symbolic ancestor whose legend later attached itself to a remarkable monument? We're going to walk carefully from legend to evidence, not to solve Tin Hinan, but to understand why her story matters, why it persists, and what it reveals about power, memory, and identity in North Africa's deep past. When most people picture ancient history, they imagine fertile valleys, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Mediterranean coast. But the Sahara, so often framed as emptiness, has always been a crossroads, not necessarily for armies in straight lines, not for imperial roads with milestones and inscriptions, but for movement, for caravans, seasonal migrations, shifting alliances, marriages between clans, and the slow transfer of language and ritual. The Sahara is not a blank space between civilizations. It is its own world, with its own historical logic. In the Hagar region, Tuareg traditions preserve memories of peoples who lived there before the true Tuareg arrived. Groups described as older, rougher, sometimes portrayed as archaic inhabitants living with donkeys and goats without camels. Whether the details are literal history or mythologized memory, the important thing is this: the Tuareg did not imagine themselves appearing out of nothing. Their traditions describe arrival, settlement, conflict, and the establishment of social order. And within that memory, a woman stands at the beginning, Tin Hinan. The legend, in its most widely repeated form, says that Tin Hinan was a noblewoman, often described as coming from the northwestern Sahara or Morocco, and that she arrived in the Hagar accompanied by a companion or servant named Takamat. The details shift depending on who tells it. In some versions, the land they enter has been devastated by war. In some, it is nearly empty. In others, it contains surviving groups pushed into harsh mountain refuges. But the core theme stays consistent. Tin Hinan arrives into a land in transition, and her presence becomes foundational. One reason this legend matters is that it is not only a story about a dramatic journey, it functions like a social map. In the Hagar Confederation, certain noble groups, especially the Kelrela, claim descent through Tin Hinan's line, and this descent is tied to legitimacy and leadership. Tin Hinan is remembered as an ancestor claimed by the suzerain group, and these traditions connect her to the logic of who can rule, who can inherit command, and how authority is recognized. So even before archaeology enters the conversation, Tin Hinan is already powerful, not necessarily as an empress in the Roman sense, but as a source of political legitimacy. And that is one of the keys to understanding why her story becomes so enduring. In societies where formal written state archives are limited or absent, genealogy is power. To claim a founding ancestor is to claim a place in the order of things. Tin Hinan becomes, in that sense, a living institution. Now we shift from memory to stone. Near Abalessa, there is a monument long associated with Tin Hinan. Tradition identifies it as her tomb, and scholars treat it as one of the first datable historical anchors in Hagar narratives, because the burial context can be studied and compared to known material timelines. But what is this monument? The Abalessa structure is described as an enclosure crowning a small rise, its interior divided by walls, almost like a complex of rooms or compartments rather than a single simple grave. And crucially, the monument may not have been built originally as a tomb at all. It resembles a tigremt, a fortified building tradition associated with Saharan and Berber architecture, possibly constructed in the 3rd century, and then later transformed into a mausoleum when a burial was inserted into one of its rooms near the end of the 4th or in the 5th century. That matters because it complicates the simple story. If the monument began as a fort or elite dwelling and then later became a tomb, then Tin Hinan, if she is the person buried there, may have been connected to a world of wealth and security, not just desert wandering. The tomb isn't a shallow grave in the sand. It is architecture, it is investment, it is an assertion. Someone important was meant to be remembered here. In the early 20th century, European and American expeditions were hungry for lost worlds. The Sahara, in colonial imagination, was a stage where archaeologists could become heroes. And that is when Tin Hinan's tomb entered a new phase of its life, one that would permanently shape how the world talks about her. The mausoleum was excavated first in 1925 by a Franco-American mission, and then again in 1933 by Maurice Regas. Those excavations did not end the mystery, they multiplied it. Because once a tomb is opened, it becomes a battleground of interpretations. Who owns the story? Who gets to name the dead? Who decides whether legend is true? Information gathered from Tuareg sources about Tin Hinan could be contradictory, and oral tradition can transform or even disappear under pressure. In other words, the very act of outside investigation can disturb the tradition it seeks to record. Here's what's easy to miss if we only focus on treasure and drama. For local people, a site like Tin Hinan's monument is not merely a ruin. It can carry spiritual charge, reputation, ambiguity, even fear. There are recorded testimonies from leading Tuareg figures describing how the tomb of Tin Hinan was not necessarily understood as only a famous chamber on the hilltop. There were claims of another grave at the foot of the hill, with a stone bearing an inscription in Tifinagh, interpreted as essentially saying, "My children, my gold is on my head." People in the area attributed a kind of religious or magical power to the mound before excavation, planting banners and wooden stakes, like those sometimes placed at saints' tombs, though no formal pilgrimage was recorded, more individual visits. That detail is huge. It tells us that even before the archaeology, this place lived in a boundary zone between reverence and uncertainty, history and spiritual imagination. And when the excavation happened, it did not simply reveal facts, it disrupted an ecosystem of meaning. Many popular retellings frame Tin Hinan as a Muslim queen. That framing is powerful because it integrates her into later Islamic narratives of North Africa. But scholars have pointed out a chronological tension. While legend may describe Tin Hinan as Muslim, the dating established from burial goods and carbon-14 evidence contradicts that. The burial context cannot be dated beyond the 5th century. That places Tin Hinan, if she corresponds to the burial, well before Islam's arrival in North Africa. So what does that mean? It means one of two things, or perhaps both. Either the burial is not Tin Hinan and the legend attached later, or Tin Hinan was a pre-Islamic figure whose story was later Islamized in oral tradition. And if you think about it, that second option makes sense. Oral tradition does not preserve the past in a sealed container. It updates, it adapts, it absorbs new religious and political realities, recasting old heroes in new cultural language.
Transport or private collection. So scholars treat the Abalessa finds as important but not definitive. The structure itself may have had multiple phases, possibly beginning as a fortified building and later repurposed into a mausoleum. If that's true, it opens a possibility. Tin Hinan may not have built the monument. She may have been buried in a structure already meaningful, an elite enclosure repurposed for burial, making her resting place both practical and symbolic. Or the burial could belong to another elite woman, and the tradition later attached Tin Hinan's name to the monument because it fit the social role the site came to represent. Either way, the monument becomes a political object in memory, not because anyone is lying, because memory works with symbols. Let's pause and think about what it means for a people to claim an ancestor. Tin Hinan's legend is intertwined with the idea of noble descent and command in the Ahagar Confederation, with the Kelrila claiming her as an ancestor whose line legitimizes leadership. This is not unique to the Tuareg. Across the world, powerful lineages use origin stories to stabilize authority. But in Tin Hinan's case, what is striking is that the origin figure is a woman. That doesn't mean Tuareg society is simply matriarchal or ruled by women. Reality is more complex, but it does suggest that female descent, uterine lines, founding mothers, can play a crucial role in legitimacy, and that changes how we imagine desert politics. We often picture nomadic worlds as purely martial and male-centered. Tin Hinan pushes against that stereotype. She shows that foundational authority can be maternal, genealogical, and symbolic, not just military. In some versions of the tradition, Tin Hinan's descendants are mapped through daughters, and those lines connect to the formation of noble groups and their roles. Whether the details are literal history or mythic structure, the function is clear. Tin Hinan becomes a framework for social organization. In that sense, she is not only a queen, she is a charter. There is a temptation with famous tombs to treat them like final answers. A body in a chamber equals a name in a legend, but the Sahara does not work that way. The Sahara keeps secrets through distance and through time. It preserves monuments, yes, but it also breaks chains of evidence. It erases settlements. It scatters documents. It forces historians to lean on fragments. That is why Tin Hinan is so compelling. She sits at the edge of what we can know, and that edge is not failure. It is where history becomes honest. The mausoleum has not finished posing enigmas, and Tuareg information about Tin Hinan can be contradictory, so Tin Hinan becomes a kind of mirror. If you want certainty, she will frustrate you. If you want meaning, she will reward you. For centuries, local tradition held that the large stone structure overlooking the junction of two wadis near Abalessa marked the tomb of Tin Hinan, a burial place of a woman whose name meant she of the tents, a metaphor for rooted nomadic life, or more poetically, the mother of us all. Modern discovery came in 1925 during the French colonial period when Byron Koen de Prorock, an expedition leader with support from the French military, opened the tomb. Though controversial for his methods, the event confirmed that a significant burial lay within. The tomb itself spans a hilltop, pear-shaped in plan, with a major axis of about 27 meters or 88 feet and containing 11 chambers or courts, a scale unusual in Saharan funerary architecture. Inside, archaeologists found what appeared to be the skeleton of an elite woman, laid out on a crafted wooden bed, her head pointing east, possibly symbolizing orientation toward sunrise or life cycles. Around her lay an extraordinary array of grave goods, heavy gold and silver jewelry, including 7 silver bracelets on her right forearm and 7 gold on her left, along with pearls, rings, beads, and finely ornamented items. Other objects told stories of far-reaching connections: a pottery lamp of Roman style, iron arrowheads, a knife, and most strikingly, a gold foil stamped with a Roman coin bearing Emperor Constantine I's image, linking this burial in the heart of the Sahara-Mediterranean worlds circa the early 4th century. Radiocarbon dating of the burial's wooden elements and stylistic analysis of the artifacts support this 4th to 5th century timeframe, placing the tomb in a historical era long before the rise of Islam in North Africa. The architectural form of the tomb makes it exceptional. Unlike the simpler graves typical of Sahara nomadic burials, this complex reflects solid stone construction, multiple chambers, and a planned internal layout, evidence that someone of high prestige was interred here. Some early thinkers like French explorer Henri Lot speculated that the tomb might incorporate elements of Roman military architecture, perhaps built atop an older structure dating from the Roman incursion into the Sahara. However, this hypothesis has largely been rejected by modern scholars. Instead, researchers see the tomb as part of a local tradition of monumental funerary architecture in Berber or Amazigh regions, which during late antiquity blended indigenous forms with influences encountered through trade and contact with Mediterranean cultures. Terminal mosaics, imported goods, and stylistic links in tomb construction suggest that trans-Saharan networks connected this part of North Africa to broader Mediterranean exchange systems, making a powerful statement about mobility, connectivity, and the reach of Saharan communities centuries before the Islamic era. One of the fascinating tensions in Tin Hinan's story is the blend of legend and material evidence. On one hand, the archaeological record confirms that a high-status burial existed at Abalessa around the 4th to 5th centuries. The tomb contained imported items and craftsmanship implying contact with Mediterranean trade networks. The individual buried was adorned with items suggesting elite social status. On the other hand, the precise identification of this individual as Tin Hinan, the legendary queen in oral tradition, cannot be proven solely by the material remains. Some features of the oral narratives may reflect later cultural overlays. For instance, traditions that describe Tin Hinan as Muslim are anachronistic, given that the burial predates the advent of Islam by several centuries. Yet the core identity as a matriarchal forebear aligns remarkably across sources. Tuareg traditions often portray her as a noble, migratory leader whose journey and settlement in the Hogar unified disparate groups into what would become a cohesive society. In some tellings, she traveled with her loyal servant Takamat and either had children herself, often named Kella, or 3 daughters with totemic desert names, or influenced kinship lineages that formed the roots of Tuareg noble clans. Whether her children were actual individuals or symbolic ancestors, the function of these stories is clear. They anchor social identity in a remote, mythic past and link contemporary groups directly to an esteemed founder. This pattern, common in societies without extensive early written records, gives a deep sense of continuity, legitimacy, and belonging. No story of an early 20th century archaeological discovery is complete without acknowledging the cultural and ethical tensions of the period. Byron Kuhn de Prorock, who led the initial excavation in 1925, was known in his time as much for adventurous charisma as for questionable scholarly rigor. Contemporary critics sometimes dubbed him the original tomb raider, juxtaposing his Sahara efforts with the sensational fame of Howard Carter's discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb just a few years earlier. Excavations of the Tin Hinan site sparked debates in academic circles, not only over interpretation of finds, but over excavation methods and treatment of artifacts. Some reports from subsequent research highlight contradictory accounts of the excavation process, removal of objects, and disputes among participants. These episodes remind us that archaeology is also a human endeavor, shaped by personalities, national interests, funding pressures, and the politics of knowledge. In colonial contexts, these dynamics often complicated the relationship between indigenous communities and outside researchers, a legacy that continues to influence heritage conversations today. The skeletal remains associated with the tomb present another layer of complexity. Initial anthropological studies suggested the skeleton belonged to a woman of substantial height and stature, possibly of Mediterranean phenotypes, a detail that fascinated early researchers seeking connections between Sahara nomads and broader populations. However, some scholars have questioned these assessments, noting that a detailed morphological analysis is complicated by the conditions of preservation and early excavation techniques. Some even debate whether the skeleton might have been male, though the weight of tradition and most interpretations hold that the burial was female. These debates do not diminish the significance of the tomb itself. Whether the individual is precisely the Tin Hinan of oral tradition is secondary to the fact that someone of extraordinary status was buried here, and that this burial was recognized as exceptional by generations of Saharan peoples long before modern archaeology arrived. Beyond academic interpretation, the Tin Hinan tomb remains a living symbol in contemporary Saharan culture. In southern Algeria, particularly near Tamanrasset and Abalessa, the tomb site continues to draw visitors and inspires cultural festivals celebrating identity and heritage. The annual Tin Hinan festival highlights traditional crafts, music, and communal memory. While tourism plays a role in promoting the region, such gatherings are fundamentally occasions where living people reaffirm connections to ancient roots, to one another, and to a landscape that often defies easy understanding. So where does Tin Hinan sit in the grand arc of North African history? She sits at an intersection between prehistory and documented history,
before widespread literacy in the region but anchored in archaeological testimony, between legend and material evidence, where oral tradition enhances but does not overwrite historical context, between local identity and global imagination. Her tomb draws scholars, tourism, and storytellers alike. Her story reminds us that civilizations and cultures do not only rise in fertile valleys or behind palace walls. Some rise in the crucible of desert migration, trade, and shifting social networks. The Sahara, far from being a mere backdrop of emptiness, was a place of movement, exchange, and innovation, connecting Mediterranean worlds to sub-Saharan zones in ways that shaped enduring identities. And within that context, Tin Hinan symbolizes not only a founding figure for the Tuareg, but the presence of women as central actors in socio-political formations long before written records. She complicates simplistic male-centered narratives of ancient leadership and invites us to consider how women's authority might have been exercised, remembered, and memorialized across centuries of oral tradition.
Destroyed. Tin Hinan's story endured because it served a purpose far beyond commemoration. It explained who belonged, who could lead, and why a people scattered across the world still recognized each other as kin. To understand Tin Hinan's lasting authority, we must step outside modern assumptions about power. In centralized states, power is enforced through law, bureaucracy, armies, and documents. In stateless or semi-stateless societies, power is enforced through relationships, through ancestry, through marriage, through shared origin stories. In these societies, a founding ancestor is not symbolic fluff. They are the legal architecture. Among the Tuareg, ancestry is not merely remembered, it is activated. Claims of descent determine marriage alliances, noble status, leadership legitimacy, and the boundaries between social classes. Tin Hinan's name functions like a keystone. To claim her is to claim rightful place. To deny her is to risk social rupture. And, crucially, she is remembered not as a distant goddess, but as a woman who walked, traveled, settled, and birthed a future. That grounding in humanity makes her memory durable. One of the most revealing aspects of Tin Hinan's story is not simply that she is female, but that no effort was made to erase that fact. In many patriarchal historical traditions, powerful women are masculinized, sidelined, or rewritten as anomalies. Their femininity becomes inconvenient. That did not happen here. Among the Tuareg, Tin Hinan is remembered explicitly as a woman, an ancestress, a mother, and a founder. This aligns with broader Tuareg social patterns. Descent and inheritance often follow maternal lines. Women traditionally own tents and domestic property. Noble identity is frequently transmitted through women. Poetry, oral tradition, and cultural continuity are often safeguarded by women. Tin Hinan fits into this system not as an exception, but as its origin point. She does not rule despite being a woman. She matters because she is one. Many versions of the legend include another woman, Takamat, often described as Tin Hinan's servant, companion, or close associate. This detail is not incidental. In oral traditions worldwide, the presence of a companion figure often signals that the story is not about solitary greatness, but about social formation. Tin Hinan does not arrive alone. She arrives with community. Takamat's role varies in different tellings, but her presence reinforces the idea that Tin Hinan's journey was not conquest, it was migration and survival. This matters because it reframes authority. Tin Hinan's power is not derived from violence or domination, but from endurance, negotiation, and continuity. She is not remembered as a destroyer, she is remembered as a root. One of the most fascinating transformations in Tin Hinan's story occurs centuries after her death. As Islam spreads across North Africa, older histories are not erased, but reinterpreted. In later oral traditions, Tin Hinan is sometimes described as Muslim. From a strictly chronological standpoint, this cannot be historically accurate. The burial at Abalessa predates Islam by several centuries, but memory is not concerned with calendars.
Destroyed. Tin Hinan's story endured because it served a purpose far beyond commemoration. It explained who belonged, who could lead, and why a people scattered across the world still recognized each other as kin. To understand Tin Hinan's lasting authority, we must step outside modern assumptions about power. In centralized states, power is enforced through law, bureaucracy, armies, and documents. In stateless or semi-stateless societies, power is enforced through relationships, through ancestry, through marriage, through shared origin stories. In these societies, a founding ancestor is not symbolic fluff. They are the legal architecture. Among the Tuareg, ancestry is not merely remembered, it is activated. Claims of descent determine marriage alliances, noble status, leadership legitimacy, and the boundaries between social classes. Tin Hinan's name functions like a keystone. To claim her is to claim rightful place. To deny her is to risk social rupture. And, crucially, she is remembered not as a distant goddess, but as a woman who walked, traveled, settled, and birthed a future. That grounding in humanity makes her memory durable. One of the most revealing aspects of Tin Hinan's story is not simply that she is female, but that no effort was made to erase that fact. In many patriarchal historical traditions, powerful women are masculinized, sidelined, or rewritten as anomalies. Their femininity becomes inconvenient. That did not happen here. Among the Tuareg, Tin Hinan is remembered explicitly as a woman, an ancestress, a mother, and a founder. This aligns with broader Tuareg social patterns. Descent and inheritance often follow maternal lines. Women traditionally own tents and domestic property. Noble identity is frequently transmitted through women. Poetry, oral tradition, and cultural continuity are often safeguarded by women. Tin Hinan fits into this system not as an exception, but as its origin point. She does not rule despite being a woman. She matters because she is one. Many versions of the legend include another woman, Takamat, often described as Tin Hinan's servant, companion, or close associate. This detail is not incidental. In oral traditions worldwide, the presence of a companion figure often signals that the story is not about solitary greatness, but about social formation. Tin Hinan does not arrive alone. She arrives with community. Takamat's role varies in different tellings, but her presence reinforces the idea that Tin Hinan's journey was not conquest, it was migration and survival. This matters because it reframes authority. Tin Hinan's power is not derived from violence or domination, but from endurance, negotiation, and continuity. She is not remembered as a destroyer, she is remembered as a root. One of the most fascinating transformations in Tin Hinan's story occurs centuries after her death. As Islam spreads across North Africa, older histories are not erased, but reinterpreted. In later oral traditions, Tin Hinan is sometimes described as Muslim. From a strictly chronological standpoint, this cannot be historically accurate. The burial at Abalessa predates Islam by several centuries, but memory is not concerned with calendars.